3 days after my husband's funeral, my daughter shoved succession papers across the boardroom table. "You're 70. Dad is gone. Sign the company over to us and learn to survive on your own." My son-in-law smirked while strangers occupied my board seats. I said nothing. Then my attorney walked in carrying a sealed DNA report. He placed it in front of my daughter and calmly said, "Read the first page out loud." "Or I will." My daughter and son-in-law instantly fell silent. This story starts quietly, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we continue, drop a comment. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted, yes or no? Your perspective might help someone else today. Note some details are fictionalized to strengthen the message. What matters is the lesson about loyalty and protecting what you've built. At 70 years old, I sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, looking at the people I used to call family. My daughter, Corinne Lockwood, 42, and dressed in sharp designer black, occupied my executive chair with cold confidence. My son-in-law, Preston Lockwood, 45 and CFO of my company, sat beside her with his eyes fixed on his expensive shoes. 18-year-old Brielle sat at the far end, clutching her phone, entirely unaware of the conspiracy surrounding her. "Sign it, Mother," Corinne said, sliding a document folder across the polished wood. "It's time." I didn't touch it. No. Her jaw tightened. The boardroom fell silent except for the hum of the HVAC system and the distant sound of freight trucks rumbling in the loading bays below. This building, Ashford Freight Group headquarters on West Monroe Street in Chicago, had been mine and Lawrence's for 43 years. We'd built it from a single flatbed and a loan we nearly couldn't repay. Now my daughter wanted to take it. "You're 70, Corinne continued, her voice sharp as the edge of the table. "You just lost Dad. You're not in any condition to run a logistics empire right now." "I'm sitting upright and conscious," I said. "That's sufficient." Preston cleared his throat, but said nothing. He never did. That was his particular talent, silence at convenient moments. Corinne leaned forward. Around us sat 5 board members I didn't recognize, all installed in the past 3 weeks, while I'd been arranging my husband's funeral. They watched me with the blank expressions of people paid to look the other way. "Now that the old man is gone," Corinne said, her voice dropping to something almost venomous, "you'll put the company in my name and fend for yourself. You're done here." The old man, that's what she called her father. Lawrence Ashford, who'd worked himself into a heart attack at 72, making sure she had an inheritance worth fighting over. I smiled. They thought they had me backed into a corner. They forgot exactly who built this empire. The boardroom door opened. Sterling Wainwright, my attorney at 55, with decades dismantling corporate predators, walked in without a word and dropped a sealed envelope on the table in front of Corinne. Certified DNA test. The return address was clear enough to read upside down. Corinne's hand froze halfway to the envelope. For the first time that morning, I saw something flicker across her face that wasn't rehearsed confidence. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," I said quietly. Preston shifted in his seat. Brielle looked up from her phone, confused. The unfamiliar board members exchanged glances. Sterling stood beside me, arms crossed, saying nothing. That was the difference between a real ally and a bought one. Sterling knew when silence had weight. Corinne didn't touch the envelope. She knew. Of course she knew. "We're not doing this now," she said, standing abruptly. "Mother, you're going to sign those succession documents, or I will have you declared mentally incompetent. Preston has 3 doctors ready to testify." "I'm sure he does," I said. She grabbed her briefcase and walked out. Preston followed like a shadow. Brielle hesitated, then trailed after them, glancing back at me with something that might have been concern or confusion. It was hard to tell anymore. The door closed. The unfamiliar board members filed out in silence, leaving me alone with Sterling. "They'll escalate," Sterling said. "I know. You're sure about this." I've never been more sure of anything in my life. To understand why I was smiling at that boardroom table, you have to go back 3 weeks to the morning after my husband's funeral. It was a Friday afternoon, September 12th, 2021. I stood in the kitchen of our Lake Forest estate, staring at the granite countertop where Lawrence used to read the morning paper with his coffee. He'd been gone 72 hours. The funeral had been the day before a tasteful service with 200 industry colleagues and exactly 3 people who actually mourned him, me, Sterling, and our warehouse manager of 30 years. Corinne hadn't cried. Not once. I was pouring myself tea when I heard the front door open. No knock, no call ahead, just the sound of heels on marble. Corinne strode into the kitchen with corporate precision, not grief. She wore a charcoal suit, business, not mourning. Preston followed silently behind her, his tie perfectly knotted, his eyes avoiding mine. She slammed a folder onto the counter hard enough to rattle the teacup. "Emergency succession documents," she said. "Sign them now." I looked at the folder but didn't touch it. "Your father's been dead 3 days, which is exactly why we need to act fast. The company is vulnerable. Competitors are circling. We need clear leadership." "We have clear leadership," I said. "Me." Corinne laughed, a short, cold sound. "You're 70, Mother. You just lost Dad. You're not in any condition to run Ashford Freight right now." The phrasing was identical to what she'd say 3 weeks later in that boardroom. She'd practiced this. "Leave it," I said. "I'll read it tonight." "No, you'll sign it now." I met her eyes. My daughter, 42 years old. I'd been in labor for 19 hours bringing her into this world. Lawrence and I had sacrificed vacations, sleep, entire years of our lives building something to leave her. And here she stood 3 days after burying her father, demanding I hand it over. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. Her expression didn't change. "You're making a mistake." "I've made plenty. This isn't one of them." Preston touched her elbow. She shook him off but turned toward the door. I stayed at the counter, hands wrapped around the teacup for warmth I couldn't seem to find. As they walked out of my kitchen, I turned toward the dark window above the sink. The afternoon sun had faded, turning the glass into a mirror. In the reflection, I watched my daughter pull out her phone and type something fast. Then she smiled, the kind of smile you never want to see on your own child's face. I didn't need to see the screen. I already knew what it said. The old woman took the bait. 3 days after I watched my daughter text that message, I stood in the executive hallway at 6 in the morning and swiped my master keycard at the archive security reader. It flashed red. I tried again, red. The bait wasn't for me to sign documents. It was to make me believe I still had control while they dismantled it piece by piece. I stood in the empty corridor on the executive floor of Ashford Freight headquarters, staring at the red light. Monday morning, September 15th, 2021. The building was silent except for the hum of ventilation and the distant rumble of early loading bay activity 3 floors below. The archives contained every contract, every ledger, every transaction record for 43 years. Lawrence and I had always maintained physical backups insurance against digital manipulation. If Corinne and Preston were staging a corporate coup, the evidence would be in those files. And now I couldn't access them. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Dalton Hayes, my 58-year-old chief operating officer who had served the company for 20 years, emerged from the break room with pale, strained features. He held a coffee cup, but wasn't drinking from it. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, "you're in early. My keycard isn't working." He glanced at the red light on the security panel, then at me. Something passed across his face, recognition, maybe guilt. "Preston ordered a complete security overhaul this weekend," he said. "Data protection protocols. Your access is temporarily restricted while technicians migrate the files." "Temporarily restricted. My own archives. In my own building." "I see," I said. "Thank you, Dalton. Enjoy your coffee." His expression said what corporate hierarchy prevented him from speaking aloud. He knew. He'd probably been ordered to implement it himself. 20 years of loyalty, and here he stood delivering someone else's lies because he had a mortgage and a daughter in college. I didn't blame him. I blamed the people who put him in that position. They thought cutting off my keycard would blind me. They forgot I built this building. I know every shadow in it. I walked to my private office and locked the door. The space still smelled faintly of the leather chair Lawrence used to occupy during late-night strategy sessions. His reading glasses sat on the credenza where he'd left them the week before his heart attack. I pushed the memories aside and knelt beside my desk. The biometric panel was hidden beneath the bottom drawer, a fingerprint scanner installed 10 years ago when we'd modernized the security infrastructure. I pressed my thumb against the cool glass. It glowed green. A small compartment clicked open. Inside sat a dust-covered external hard drive, a relic from an era when Lawrence and I had trusted each other more than we trusted technology. I connected it to my laptop and waited. The system came alive. Legacy backdoor access coded directly into the architecture before Preston had ever set foot in this building. It bypassed his new firewalls, invisibly a ghost in the machine. Financial records bloomed across my screen. I navigated to the wire transfer queue, and there it was. Pending authorization, $4.8 million transfer to offshore account TK447CAYMAN. Authorization signature Vivian L. Ashford, except I'd never signed it. The digital signature was a perfect forgery, probably created using Preston's CFO access and a stolen encryption key. My hands moved across the keyboard with cold precision. I couldn't cancel the transfer that would alert them, but I could freeze it in isolated digital purgatory suspended in a processing loop that would hold it hostage until I decided what to do. One keystroke, and before my finger could press the enter key, the sharp ring of my private cell phone shattered the silence. "Unknown number," I answered. "Is this Vivian Ashford?" a professional female voice asked. "Yes. This is Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Your granddaughter Brielle has been in a severe motorcycle accident on the interstate. She's in our trauma unit. You need to come immediately." The words didn't register for 3 full seconds. Then I was moving, grabbing my coat, my keys abandoning the laptop still glowing with evidence of embezzlement. I drove through Chicago morning traffic with the kind of focus that comes from decades of crisis management. 20 minutes. Northwestern Memorial rose against the skyline, all glass and steel, and the particular smell of antiseptic that hospital ventilation systems never quite mask. The trauma ward corridor was fluorescent bright and too cold. Corinne stood near the nurse's station, pacing, typing on her phone. She looked annoyed rather than devastated. Preston sat in a plastic chair with his head buried in his hands. "What happened?" I asked. Corinne barely glanced up. "Motorcycle accident on I-94. She crashed into a median barrier at 70 miles per hour. This is a complete disaster. We were scheduled to finalize the trust transfer this afternoon." Trust transfer. Her daughter was in a trauma bay and she was thinking about paperwork. "Where is she?" I asked. "Surgery. They're stabilizing her now." Preston lifted his head. His face was gray, his eyes red-rimmed. At least one of them looked like a parent. A tired-looking attending physician in blood-stained surgical scrubs stepped out from the trauma bay. "Lockwood family?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm Dr. Brennan. Brielle is stable, but her hemoglobin levels are dropping critically. We need to administer a blood transfusion immediately." "Then do it," Corinne snapped. Dr. Brennan's expression didn't change. "We need direct family donors. Her blood type is somewhat rare and our reserves are low. We'd like to test immediate family members, first parents, grandparents." "What type does she need?" I asked. Dr. Brennan looked directly at Corinne and said 4 words that would unravel 18 years of carefully constructed lies. "She has AB-positive blood." My mind, trained by decades of forensic analysis, immediately began calculating. I am type O. Lawrence was type O. Corinne is type A. The genetic math was screaming. I stood perfectly still in that sterile hospital corridor, listening to the doctor's words echo in my mind, while basic high school biology screamed alarms I could not ignore. A B-positive blood. My brain, trained by 43 years of contract forensics and supply chain logistics, began processing variables the way a computer processes code. I am type O. Lawrence was type O. 2 type O parents can only produce type O offspring that's genetic law, immutable as gravity. Corinne is type A. Scientifically possible if one of us carried a recessive A allele, though we didn't. I'd reviewed our medical records after her birth in 1979, back when such details still mattered to new parents. But AB positive, that required one parent with an A or AB allele and another with a B or AB allele. Corinne is type A. For Brielle to be AB positive, her biological father would need to carry the B allele. I looked at Preston. He was staring at the floor-jaw clenched neck slick with sweat. His hands gripped his knees with the white-knuckled tension of someone holding onto the edge of a cliff. He was absolutely terrified. He knew. The genetic math exposed him. "Doctor," I said carefully, keeping my voice steady. "Could there be a laboratory error, cross-contamination during the emergency intake?" Dr. Brennan shook his head. "We run confirmatory tests on all trauma cases requiring transfusion. The result was verified twice." Corinne's expression remained perfectly controlled, rehearsed calm. "These mistakes happen constantly in chaotic emergency rooms," she said smoothly. "I'm sure the lab will issue a correction." "The lab doesn't make mistakes on blood type," Dr. Brennan said flatly. "We'd kill people." Silence settled over the corridor like a physical weight. "Can I donate?" I asked. "You're type O," Dr. Brennan said, consulting his tablet. "Universal donor, but not a match for AB positive. We need AB or AB donors. Parents are usually the first option." He looked at Corinne and Preston expectantly. Preston's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. I need to make a call. Work emergency." He stood and walked toward the elevator with the unsteady gait of someone drunk or in shock. Corinne watched him go, her face a mask of controlled irritation. "I'll have my blood typed," she said, "though I'm almost certain I'm not a match." A mother knows her daughter's lies the way a wolf knows the scent of blood on the wind. "Take your time," Dr. Brennan said. "We've already started her on O negative from our reserves. She's stable for now." He disappeared back into the trauma bay. I stood alone in the corridor with Corinne. 42 years of shared history hung between us, birthday parties and piano recitals, and the careful construction of a family legacy that was apparently built on sand. You should go home, Mother, Corinne said. You look exhausted. I'll stay. There's nothing you can do here. I met her eyes. I'm her grandmother. I'll stay. Corinne's jaw tightened. For just a moment, something flickered across her face, calculation, maybe fear. Then it was gone, replaced by the smooth corporate mask she wore like armor. Suit yourself, she said, and walked toward the elevator. I watched her go. Watched the woman I'd raised disappear into the steel box that would carry her down to street level and back to whatever conspiracy she was orchestrating with my son-in-law. Then I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls. The first was to Sterling. I need you to find out Preston Lockwood's blood type, medical records, insurance files, donation history. I don't care how you get it. The second was to a private genetics laboratory that operated 24 hours for law enforcement clients. I need a full DNA analysis, maternity, paternity, familial markers, 48-hour turnaround. Money is not an obstacle. The third call was to a medical supply store that catered to home healthcare workers. I spent the afternoon in the hospital cafeteria drinking terrible coffee and staring at genetic inheritance charts on my laptop. The science was clear. The deception was clear. What wasn't clear was how deep it went or how long they'd been planning this. At 7 p.m., I went home. I ate nothing. I sat in Lawrence's study, surrounded by his books and his awards, and the faint smell of his cologne still lingering in the upholstery. I allowed myself exactly 60 seconds to grieve the grandchild who was never mine. Then I became a hunter. At 11:30 p.m., I returned to Northwestern Memorial carrying a paper bag containing fresh fruit, bottled water, and a grandmother's concern. The night shift nurse waved me through with a sympathetic smile. Brielle's private recovery room was dim lit only by the green glow of monitoring equipment and the muted television mounted on the wall. She slept deeply, probably sedated noise-canceling headphones covering her ears. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the girl I'd believed was my granddaughter for 18 years. She had Corinne's dark hair, Preston's narrow chin, nothing of me, nothing of Lawrence. The realization settled in my chest like a stone. I moved silently to the small bathroom attached to the recovery room. Latex gloves from the medical supply store snapped tight against my wrists. The toothbrush sat in a plastic cup beside the sink, used still damp. I sealed it in a sterile collection bag. The hairbrush on the vanity yielded several long, dark strands. Another bag. I worked with surgical precision, touching nothing else, leaving no trace of my presence beyond what a concerned grandmother might naturally leave. 3 minutes. That's all it took to collect enough DNA evidence to unravel 18 years of lies. I removed the gloves, disposed of them in the bathroom trash beneath crumpled paper towels, and placed the collection bags in my purse, beside an envelope containing $5,000 in cash, withdrawn that afternoon from a personal account Preston had no access to. Brielle never stirred. I bent and kissed her forehead, a gesture of affection I'd performed 1,000 times, now transformed into something closer to farewell. "I'm sorry," I whispered, "for whatever they've done to you." Then I left. I drove to Biogenetics Lab at 2 a.m, the sterile bags resting in my purse beside the cash. The technician who answered my call promised results in 48 hours. I drove home in the dark and did not sleep. 48 hours after I delivered those samples in darkness, I returned to Biogenetics Lab in the cold gray light of Thursday morning to collect the truth. I hadn't slept since Monday night. I'd tried. I'd lain in Lawrence's bed and stared at the ceiling while my mind ran probability calculations and genetic inheritance tables and the memory of Preston's sweating, terrified face in that hospital corridor. Now I sat in my vehicle in the furthest corner of the lab's parking lot in Northbrook, Illinois, watching early commuters filter into the building's front entrance. Normal people. People whose families were exactly what they appeared to be. I walked inside at 7 a.m. sharp. Ms. Hartley, the professional lab receptionist behind the frosted glass partition, retrieved my file without emotion. Barcode 2847 results for Subject A and Subject B. Everything is complete. "Thank you," I said. She slid the tamper-proof envelope across the counter. My hands did not shake when I took it. That would come later. I returned to my vehicle, started the engine for warmth against the September morning chill, and opened the seal with trembling fingers. The document was clinical, sterile. 6 pages of genetic marker analysis, chromosome comparisons, statistical probabilities rendered in precise scientific language. I skipped to the summary on the final page. Probability of biological mother-child relationship between Subject A and Subject B, 0.00%. Subject B is excluded as the biological offspring of Subject A. Conclusion: no genetic relationship detected. The words sat on the page like an accusation. I had spent 48 hours preparing myself for this moment. Nothing could have prepared me for this. I read it again, then a third time. The science was unambiguous. The methodology was sound. The conclusion was absolute. Brielle Lockwood was not my granddaughter. Not through Corinne, not through Lawrence, not through any bloodline I could trace back 7 generations of Illinois shipping merchants and railroad builders and the careful accumulation of family wealth. My hands started shaking, actually shaking something they hadn't done since Lawrence's funeral, maybe not even then. I gripped the steering wheel to steady them. The heater blew warm air across my face, but I felt cold, bone-deep cold. The kind that comes from discovering the foundation you've been standing on for 18 years was built on sand. I thought about the first time I'd held Brielle in the hospital nursery, September 2003. She'd been so small, wrapped in a pink blanket, her eyes closed against the fluorescent lights. Corinne had been exhausted from the delivery, and Preston had paced the corridor making business calls, so I'd sat in the rocking chair and cradled my granddaughter and whispered promises about the legacy we'd build together. All of it every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every school recital where I sat in the front row built on a lie. 18 years. For 18 years I had poured my heart into a vessel that was never mine to fill. I looked down at the document again. The genetic markers were listed in neat columns. Subject A, Subject B, alleles that should have matched and didn't, inheritance patterns that should have aligned and refused. The parking lot was emptying. Morning shift workers disappearing into their offices and laboratories and the ordinary machinery of their ordinary lives. I sat alone in my vehicle, holding proof that my family was a carefully constructed fiction. Questions bloomed in my analytical mind like weeds through concrete. If Corinne was not Brielle's biological mother, then who was? If Preston was the biological father, and the AB-positive blood type suggested he might be depending on his genetics, then whose child was this? Did Corinne know? Had she orchestrated an adoption and hidden it from me for 18 years? Or was she a victim of deception, too, believing Brielle was hers through some medical fraud at the hospital? I thought about the way she'd reacted in that hospital corridor. The controlled irritation, the casual dismissal of the blood type anomaly, the complete absence of maternal panic when her daughter lay in a trauma bay. She knew. The realization settled over me like ice water. Corinne knew Brielle wasn't her biological daughter. She had known for 18 years, and she'd never said a word. The question was why? What advantage did a fake grandchild give her? What pieces of this conspiracy required a child who looked legitimate on paper but carried no Ashford blood? The succession documents flashed through my mind. The emergency paperwork she'd demanded I sign 3 days after Lawrence's funeral. Transfer of assets. Transfer of control. Transfer of everything we'd built. If Brielle wasn't a blood heir, then the careful estate planning Lawrence and I had constructed trusts and inheritance vehicles designed to keep Ashford freight in family hands for generations became vulnerable, exploitable. They needed me to believe Brielle was my granddaughter, needed me to sign documents protecting her inheritance, needed me to structure the company transfer in ways that would benefit a child who wasn't actually part of the bloodline. And then what? Once the paperwork was signed and notarized and legally binding, what then? I thought about the frozen wire transfer on my laptop, the first extraction, probably not the last. My daughter wasn't trying to inherit the company. She was trying to loot it. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the genetic analysis, while my mind assembled the pieces of a conspiracy I'd been too grieving and too trusting to see. Lawrence had died of a heart attack. Natural causes, the doctors said. Stress and age and 43 years of building an empire. But Preston was CFO. Preston had access to everything: financial records, insurance policies, medical histories. Preston, who couldn't meet my eyes in that boardroom. Preston, who'd sweated through his expensive suit when the doctor announced Brielle's blood type. I needed the other half of the genetic equation. I needed to know whose child Brielle actually was, because that would tell me who was orchestrating this and how deep the deception ran. I folded the laboratory report and placed it in my purse beside the first envelope. I allowed myself exactly 60 seconds to grieve the granddaughter who was never mine. Then I started the engine. I still needed the other half of the answer, the part that would tell me whose child Brielle actually was. That same Thursday afternoon, I drove to Corinne's residence with a bag of organic recovery supplements for Brielle and a single, carefully chosen question designed to expose my daughter's lies. The answer was already in my purse. The laboratory report confirming Brielle wasn't my granddaughter sat folded beside my wallet. but I needed to know if Corinne was a victim or an architect. Her house sat in a manicured suburb north of the city, modern glass and steel purchased with a salary that didn't quite justify the mortgage. I'd never ask questions. Family helped family. I rang the doorbell at 2 p.m. Corinne answered, wearing athleisure and an expression of mild surprise. "Mother, I wasn't expecting you." "I brought supplements for Brielle," I said, holding up the paper bag. "Vitamin C, iron, turmeric for inflammation. The hospital diet won't help her recover." "That's thoughtful." She stepped aside to let me in. The foyer was pristine. White marble floors, minimalist furniture, a $10,000 abstract painting. Everything carefully curated to project success. "Is she resting?" I asked. "Upstairs. Preston's handling the medical arrangements, insurance paperwork, follow-up appointments." We walked to the kitchen. Corinne poured 2 glasses of sparkling water with practiced hospitality. I sat at the island counter and watched her move through the space with controlled grace. "The hospital mentioned something unusual during Brielle's emergency intake," I said carefully, keeping my voice casual. "They recorded her blood type as AB positive. I thought that seemed odd given our family history." I watched her face with the precision of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing changed. No surprise, no confusion, no maternal alarm. Then tears appeared in her eyes, perfectly timed, perfectly proportioned. "Oh, Mother," she said, her voice breaking in exactly the right places. "Emergency labs make these mistakes constantly under pressure. I'm sure the hospital will issue a correction in their official records. You know how chaotic trauma centers are." A mother knows her daughter's tears. I had held her through skinned knees, broken hearts, failed exams. This was not grief. This was theater. "Of course," I said. "I'm sure you're right." She smiled, relieved. She thought that I'd accepted the explanation. She had no idea I'd just confirmed everything I needed to know. Corinne wasn't a victim of Preston's deception. She was his partner. We made small talk for another 15 minutes. I asked about Brielle's recovery timeline. Corinne provided vague answers about physical therapy and monitoring. Preston never came downstairs. I left at 2:30 with the same bag of supplements I'd brought. "Give these to Brielle when she's ready," I said at the door. "Thank you, Mother. You've always been so thoughtful." I drove 3 blocks before pulling over in a grocery store parking lot. My hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. 18 years of lies delivered with perfect precision. 18 years of watching me pour love and legacy planning into a child who wasn't mine while they orchestrated something I still didn't fully understand. I made 2 phone calls, one to Sterling, one to a private investigator he'd mentioned years ago. Sterling answered on the first ring. "Did you get the results?" "Yes, Brielle is not my granddaughter. 0 genetic relationship." Silence on the other end. Then, "I'm sorry, Vivian. Don't be. I need you to do something else. I need Preston's DNA tested against Brielle's. Can you access his medical records through corporate insurance files? That's legally complicated." "I don't care about complicated. I care about truth." Another pause. "Give me 24 hours. "Thank you." I went home and waited. Friday morning arrived with the gray light of September rain. My phone rang at 7 a.m. Sterling. "I have it," he said. "Can you come to my office?" I was there in 20 minutes. Sterling's law office occupied the 14th floor of a building on LaSalle Street. He met me in the conference room with a sealed envelope identical to the one I'd collected from Biogenetics Lab. "How did you get it so fast?" I asked. "I have contacts in medical records procurement. Don't ask for details." I took the envelope and opened it standing up. The document was clinical, professional, devastating. DNA analysis report Subject C and Subject B. Genetic markers 24 of 24 matched. Probability of biological father-child relationship between Subject C and Subject B, 99.97%. Conclusion: Subject C cannot be excluded as the biological father of Subject B. Preston was Brielle's father. The room tilted slightly. I sat down in one of Sterling's leather conference chairs and read the report again. Preston Lockwood, my son-in-law, my CFO, the man who'd married my daughter 22 years ago, had fathered a child with someone else. Then he and Corinne had somehow passed that child off as their legitimate daughter and convinced me to treat her as my granddaughter for 18 years. "Are you all right?" Sterling asked. "No." He poured water from the pitcher on the conference table. "I didn't touch it. The question now," I said slowly, "is who is the biological mother? That's the piece we're missing. And why did they do this? Why plant an illegitimate child at the center of the family?" Sterling leaned back in his chair. "What advantage does a fake grandchild give them?" "Access," I said, "to the estate planning, to the inheritance structures, to everything Lawrence and I built to protect the bloodline. They needed you to believe she was yours. And once I signed the succession documents transferring assets into trusts for Brielle, They could exploit those trusts, drain them. The child becomes a vehicle for theft. The pieces assembled themselves in my mind like a puzzle I'd been staring at for weeks without seeing the picture. Preston didn't just have an affair. He planted his illegitimate child into the center of my family and watched me love her with every ounce of my grandmother's heart, while he positioned himself to steal everything. "I need to know how deep this goes," I said. "The financial fraud, the company access, everything." Sterling nodded. "I'll start pulling records." I sat in my vehicle holding both DNA reports, the first proving Corinne was not the mother, the second confirming Preston was the father. 18 years of total calculated deception. I started the engine and drove straight back to Sterling's office. The conspiracy was deeper than biology. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot had spread into my company. 2 nights after securing those DNA reports, I sat alone in my darkened home office and activated the backdoor terminal. This time I was hunting money. Sterling had spent the weekend pulling financial records through legal channels. I'd spent it using channels that weren't legal at all. The legacy backdoor access gave me visibility into every transaction Preston had touched as CFO, every ledger he'd manipulated, every account he thought was hidden. The frozen wire transfer glowed on my screen. Nearly $5 million. I'd stopped it from leaving, but I hadn't traced where it came from. Now I would. I ran the transaction history backward through the digital architecture, following the money like a bloodhound following scent. Preston had routed it through 3 shell accounts, standard laundering procedure to obscure the source. But he'd made one mistake. He'd used internal company routing numbers, which meant the back door could track it. The trail led to an account I recognized immediately. Ashford Freight Group Employee Pension Fund. I sat back in my chair staring at the screen. The pension fund. The sacred retirement savings of every truck driver, warehouse worker, and cargo handler who'd built this company alongside Lawrence and me. 317 employees who trusted us with their futures. Preston had been stealing their retirement. I scrolled through the transaction log. The theft hadn't been a single extraction, it had been systematic. Monthly withdrawals small enough to avoid triggering automatic audit alerts, large enough to accumulate into millions over time. The ledger timestamp on the first withdrawal read January 14th, 2021. I knew that date, January 14th, 3 days after the oncologist sat us down and said the words we had been dreading. Terminal, stage 4, pancreatic cancer, maybe 6 months if we're lucky. While I was holding my dying husband's hand, they were calculating how much they could steal. They'd weaponized Lawrence's dying as their distraction window. They'd known I'd be consumed with medical appointments and hospice arrangements and the terrible logistics of watching someone you love disappear by degrees. They'd counted on my grief to blind me, and it had worked. I traced the withdrawals through the months: January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August. Every month like clockwork while Lawrence weakened, and I pretended to believe the doctors when they talked about treatment options. He died on September 9th, 2021. The funeral was September 11th. On September 12th, 3 days after we buried him, Corinne had walked into my kitchen and demanded I sign succession documents. The pattern was sickeningly clear. I pressed my hand flat against the desk to stop it from shaking. Then I picked up the phone and called the investigator Sterling had recommended. His name was Callan Reeves, former FBI white-collar crime specialist. Discreet, thorough, expensive. "I need everything," I told him. "Financial records, travel history, phone logs, adoption paperwork. I need to know exactly what they did and when they did it." "That's a broad scope," Callan said. "You want to narrow the time frame? Start 18 years ago, September 2003. Work forward. What am I looking for? Proof of a conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. Possibly more." A pause. "This is a family matter." It was. Now it's a criminal matter. "Understood. Give me 2 weeks." 2 weeks became the longest 14 days of my life. I went through the motions, attended board meetings, reviewed contracts, smiled at colleagues who had no idea the company was being looted from within. I visited Brielle in the hospital, brought her flowers, sat beside her bed while she recovered. She looked at me with genuine affection. She had no idea she was a stolen child, a fabricated heir, a vehicle for theft. Friday afternoon, October 3rd, 2021. Callan called and asked me to meet him at a diner in Skokie Neutral Ground, public enough to be safe, anonymous enough for privacy. I arrived at 2 p.m. The diner was a relic from the 1970s, all cracked vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting and the smell of burned coffee. Callan Reeves, a 48-year-old former FBI white-collar crime agent I'd hired through Sterling's recommendation, sat in the back corner with a thick leather folder on the table. He was lean and tired-looking, with the sharp eyes of someone trained to see lies. We shook hands. I ordered coffee I wouldn't drink. "What did you find?" I asked. Callan spread documents across the sticky table with methodical precision. There is absolutely no record of a legal adoption process for Brielle within any family court system across any state jurisdiction in the United States, he said. Not Illinois, not neighboring states, nowhere. I'd expected this. Hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch. Her birth certificate is a total fabrication. He continued, sliding a certified copy toward me. Signed through a small municipal notary office in Cook County that was shut down for corruption charges in 2010. The notary, Rebecca Finch, was convicted of processing fraudulent identity documents for a human trafficking ring. Human trafficking, I repeated. The investigation focused on falsified immigration papers, but she also did birth certificates, social security cards, adoption papers, anything people were willing to pay for. He pulled out another document. Medical records. There are no hospital records for Brielle's birth, no pediatric visits, no immunization records. Nothing exists before age 3. Then suddenly in 2006 she appears in the system with a complete medical history that claims routine checkups from infancy, but none of those earlier appointments actually exist in any database. She literally appeared out of thin air, I said. Exactly. Someone built her identity backward, creating a paper trail that looks legitimate on the surface, but collapses under forensic analysis. Preston? Preston had the resources, the access, and the motive. CFO of a major freight company, connections to municipal offices through business licensing, enough money to pay off corrupt officials. Callan leaned back in the booth. This isn't just corporate fraud, Mrs. Ashford. This is major federal identity fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1028, criminal felony territory. If we take this to federal prosecutors, they'll pursue charges. The words hung in the air between us. Federal prosecutors, criminal charges, my daughter, my son-in-law. There's more, Callan said quietly. He turned to the next page in the folder and slid a surveillance photograph toward me. About the mother, Brielle's real biological mother. The surveillance photograph Callan slid across the diner table showed a tired-looking woman in her early 40s walking alone down a cracked sidewalk in some forgotten industrial town. This was the woman whose daughter was stolen. Her name is Mira Valdez, Callan said. 42 years old, works part-time at a medical supply warehouse in Gary, Indiana. Single mother, no criminal record. I stared at the photograph. The woman looked worn down by life, shoulders slumped, carrying a grocery bag that probably contained the cheapest items from the discount aisle. "Tell me," I said. Callan pulled out a timeline he'd assembled from phone records and bank statements. Preston engaged in a secret 3-year affair with her starting in 2000. When she became pregnant in 2002, he promised he would finalize his divorce and marry her. She believed him. Of course she did. Preston could sell ice to Arctic researchers when he wanted to. The baby was born in September 2003. For the first 3 months, Preston visited regularly, played the devoted father, brought gifts, promised he was handling the divorce paperwork. And then, 3 months after the baby was born, he told Mira he needed to bring the infant to a specialized family clinic for medical verification. Something about genetic screening required for his health insurance. She trusted him. He took the child and vanished. The word hung in the air like smoke. Phone disconnected. Email blocked. She tried to reach him through Ashford Freight corporate offices. Your legal team sent her a cease and desist letter threatening harassment charges if she attempted contact again. My legal team, my company, my resources weaponized against a woman whose only crime was trusting the wrong man. Did she go to the police? I asked. She tried. But Preston had covered himself perfectly. No formal custody arrangement existed. Legally, as the biological father, he had parental rights. The police told her it was a civil family matter. She'd need a lawyer. Did she hire one? She couldn't afford one. She was 24 years old, working 2 part-time jobs. Preston had corporate attorneys. She had nothing. Callan turned a page in his folder. She attempted to visit your headquarters once October 2004. Your security team physically escorted her off the premises. She searched for 3 years, went into debt, lost her apartment. Finally stopped in 2007 because she literally ran out of money. She had no idea where her daughter was or if she was even alive. None. For 18 years, she's been living with that question. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I asked Callan for her contact information. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, But I knew that when this was over, I owed that woman a phone call. "There's one more thing," Callan said quietly. He pulled out a final document, an email recovered from a decommissioned server during routine corporate data migration. This was sent 18 years ago, 3 weeks after Preston and Corinne brought Brielle home. The sender, Corinne Lockwood. The recipient, Preston Lockwood. Subject line, our arrangement. I read it twice. The email was clinical, businesslike, absolutely devoid of emotion. Corinne wrote that she'd discovered Brielle was Preston's illegitimate child through a private investigator she'd hired. She'd known about Mira. She'd known about the pregnancy. She'd known everything. But instead of divorce, she proposed a deal. "Mother's trust clause only applies to biological heirs," the email read. "The doctors confirmed last year that I cannot have children. If she finds out, I lose everything. But if we present your illegitimate daughter as our adopted child, the inheritance remains intact." I sat very still for a very long time. Some silences need to be respected. When I finally spoke, my voice was completely steady. The email detailed the terms Preston would erase all connection to Mira Valdez, legal, financial, personal. The child would be documented as a private adoption. I would never know the truth. The final line read, "This is business, Preston, not sentiment." "My daughter was never a deceived wife," I said. "She was an architect of the crime from day one." "Yes." I folded the email and placed it in my purse beside the DNA reports. My daughter had discovered she was infertile. Instead of telling me, instead of trusting that I would love her regardless, she'd orchestrated an 18-year conspiracy to steal another woman's child and secure an inheritance. "I need copies of everything," I said. "Already made." Callan slid a flash drive across the table. "Encrypted, password protected." I left the diner at 9 p.m. and drove home in silence. Before I tell you what happened next, are you still with me? Comment: A, if you think Corinne deserves prison, or B, if there's any part wondering if she was trapped too. Add one reason in 10 words or less. Please note the next part includes recreated details for narrative impact. But the lesson is what matters. Saturday night, I sat in my home office and called Sterling. "We have everything," I said. "DNA evidence, financial fraud, identity theft, email documentation." "Then we're ready to file," Sterling said. "Wait, what's the status of the federal investigation?" A pause. "How did you know about that?" "I didn't, I'm guessing." Sterling laughed, a short, tired sound. "The bank's compliance security team flagged Preston's irregular wire transfers 3 weeks ago. They quietly launched an internal federal probe. They're preparing reports for the Treasury Department and FBI. So there are 2 investigations running simultaneously. 3, actually. The FBI Fraud Division opened their own case based on identity document irregularities that surfaced during routine background checks for a government contract bid. They don't know about each other. 3 separate, uncoordinated investigations, all converging on Preston and Corinne from different angles: banking fraud, identity fraud, and my private intelligence network. They're boxed in, I said. Completely. They have no idea the walls are closing in. Then it's time to let them think they've won. I hung up with Sterling and sat in the darkness for a long time, thinking about Mira Valdez walking down that cracked sidewalk, carrying her discount groceries, living with 18 years of unanswered questions. Then I picked up my phone and called my daughter. My voice was tired and soft, the voice of a woman who had finally given up fighting. "Corinne," I said, "you were right. I can't carry the company anymore. I'll sign the papers. Come to the house Monday. We'll do it quietly, just family." There was a pause. Then she said, "Of course, Mother. We'll be there." I could hear the smile in her voice. 2 nights after I made that surrender call, I sat alone in my darkened study at midnight and read through every single line of the succession contract they had delivered weeks ago, this time hunting for the trap I knew would be buried inside. She had smiled when I said I would sign. That smile told me everything I needed to know. This was not a simple asset transfer. This was something worse. The contract sat on my desk under the green glow of the banker's lamp Lawrence had used for 40 years. 51 pages of dense legal language formatted to look like standard corporate succession documentation. I read every word. The first 45 pages were legitimate transfer of ownership, board restructuring, retirement compensation, standard procedure for executive transition. Page 46 contained routine indemnification language protecting the company from litigation. Page 47 was different. I read it 3 times. All incoming executive management shall be held harmless from any prior accounting or financial discrepancies occurring before the transition date of October 15, 2021. Held harmless. A blanket immunity clause for Preston and Corinne, absolving them from responsibility for anything that happened before they officially took control, including nearly $5 million stolen from the employee pension fund. I turned to page 49. The outgoing CEO formally validates and attests to the accuracy of all historic asset declarations and financial statements prior to the scheduled November 1st, 2021 corporate audit mandated by Federal Banking Compliance Review. My signature would not just transfer the company, it would legally designate me as the person responsible for validating every financial transaction in company history, including the systematic theft that began 3 days after Lawrence's terminal diagnosis. They were not just stealing my company, they were framing me for their crimes. When federal auditors discovered the missing pension funds, the contract would show that I had formally validated all financial records as accurate. My signature would become evidence of my guilt, not theirs. Preston and Corinne would walk away clean. I would face federal prosecution. They intended to let me die in prison for money they stole while my husband was dying. I picked up the phone and called Sterling at midnight. "Sterling," I said, "cancel everything for the rest of the month. We are going to war." The next 5 days, I transformed myself into exactly what they wanted to see. I stopped brushing my hair with my usual precision. I wore the same black cardigan 3 days in a row. I let mail pile up on the kitchen counter. I moved through the house like a ghost, touching Lawrence's things with aimless grief. Dalton called twice about urgent company matters. I told him I could not handle it anymore, my voice cracking with manufactured exhaustion. Word spread through the office Mrs. Ashford was not coping well. That was exactly what I wanted them to hear. Monday evening, October 12th, 2021, 7:30 p.m. Corinne and Preston arrived at the estate in Preston's black Mercedes. I watched from the upstairs window as they exchanged a look and walked to the door with confident strides. I met them in the living room, hair deliberately unbrushed, pulled back in a messy knot, eyes reddened with saline drops applied 5 minutes earlier. Posture, hunched shoulders curved inward. I sat in Lawrence's favorite armchair, clutching his framed photograph against my chest. When they walked in, I looked up with wet eyes and managed a trembling smile. "Thank you for coming," I whispered. Corinne's expression shifted immediately. She flashed a quick, triumphant look at Preston. They believed it completely. "Of course, Mother," Corinne said, her voice smooth and victorious. "You sounded so tired on the phone. We have been worried about you." They had spent 18 years learning how to perform grief and love for my benefit. It took me exactly 1 evening to learn how to perform surrender for theirs. "I cannot carry the company anymore," I said, my voice breaking in precisely the right places. "Without Lawrence, none of it means anything. The boardroom, the contracts, the legacy, it is all just weight now, just crushing weight." I pressed Lawrence's photograph tighter and let fresh tears spill down my cheeks. "I just want peace," I whispered. "Just some peace before I'm too old to enjoy it." Preston leaned forward, his face arranged in concern. "You deserve peace," he said. "You should not have to carry that burden alone anymore." "We can handle everything," Corinne added. "The operations, the board meetings, all of it. You can finally rest." I nodded slowly, wiping my eyes with a strategically placed tissue. "The signing," I said. "Friday morning. I want to do it at the office in the boardroom, where Lawrence and I started everything. It feels right to end it there." "Of course," Corinne said. "Whatever you need." "Will Brielle be there?" I asked, my voice small and fragile. Corinne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She is still recovering from the accident." "I understand," I said quickly. "I just thought family should be together for something like this." "We will be there," Preston said. "That is what matters." They stayed for 20 minutes. I maintained the performance perfectly. Trembling hands, vacant stares, long pauses, where I seemed to lose track of the conversation. The grieving widow finally broken by loss. When they stood to leave, Corinne hugged me. I let myself collapse slightly into her arms. "You are doing the right thing, Mother," she whispered. "Friday morning, 10 a.m. We will have everything ready." "Thank you," I breathed. "I cannot carry it anymore. Without Lawrence, none of it means anything. Just take it. I will sign everything Friday." "Of course, Mother. You have worked so hard for so many years. It is time for you to finally step back and rest. You deserve peace." Preston added, "We will have the board ready by Friday morning. You do not have to worry about a single thing anymore." I walked them to the door with slow, defeated steps. Watched them exchange another triumphant glance as they descended the front steps. I stood at the window and watched Corinne's taillights disappear down the dark driveway. The moment they cleared the gate, I straightened. My posture, wiped my eyes, and pulled out my phone. I sent a single text to Sterling Friday as confirmed. Proceed with everything. The broken widow was gone. The executioner had work to do. Friday morning, October 17th, arrived with cold autumn light flooding my bedroom windows. This was the day I would walk into that boardroom and burn down everything my daughter tried to steal. The executioner had work to do, and it began at 7 a.m. with ritual precision. I stood before my closet and pulled out the Navy power suit I had worn 30 years ago when Lawrence and I secured our first multi-million-dollar freight contract. Not morning attire, battle armor. The fabric still fit perfectly. I had maintained my posture and discipline through 4 decades of corporate warfare. I fastened the classic pearl necklace around my throat, Lawrence's 25th anniversary gift, given 3 years before his death. My fingers were steady. My reflection showed no trace of the broken widow who had sobbed 5 days ago, while Corinne watched with triumphant satisfaction. That woman was gone. The co-founder who had survived corporate wars, economic crashes, and the systematic construction of an $18 million empire stood in her place. I looked at Lawrence's photograph on my dresser. "For you," I said quietly. I had spent 43 years building an empire. I had spent the last 5 weeks building a trap. This morning I was going to walk into that boardroom and let them think they had won right up until the moment I closed the door behind them. The drive to Ashford Freight headquarters took 20 minutes. I arrived at 8:30. Sterling met me in the lobby at 8:45. "Everything is ready," he said quietly. "Federal agents. Positioned. Agent Holloway has a tactical team standing by. They will move on my signal." I nodded. "Then let us finish this." We rode the elevator to the 14th floor in silence. I buttoned my suit jacket with deliberate movements. I had spent 43 years building an empire. Today I was going to walk into that boardroom and reclaim it. The boardroom doors stood open. I stepped through at exactly 9 a.m. The room fell silent. Corinne sat in my executive chair at the head of the table, surrounded by 5 unfamiliar board members, the corporate mercenaries she had installed. Preston stood beside her, holding the succession contract. Brielle sat at the far end, recovered enough from her accident to attend looking uncomfortable. "Mother," Corinne said, her voice smooth with false warmth, "you look well. We were concerned after Monday." "I am fine," I said. I did not sit down. I stood at the opposite end of the table, hands folded, posture straight. Corinne slid the succession document down the polished mahogany surface. "Sign it, Mother," she said. "It is time." I looked at the document, looked at my daughter, looked at Preston, who could not quite meet my eyes. Then I said one word. "No." The room went very still. "Excuse me," Corinne said. "No," I repeated. "I will not be signing that document. Not today, not ever." Corinne's expression shifted, confusion flickering into anger. "We discussed this. You agreed." "I agreed to nothing. I performed surrender. There is a difference." The boardroom door opened. Sterling walked in, carrying a leather briefcase. He placed 2 documents on the table in front of Corinne. "DNA analysis report," he said, clearly his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Certified by Biogenetics Laboratory. Probability of biological mother-child relationship between Corinne Lockwood and Brielle Lockwood, 0.00%. Brielle gasped. One of the unfamiliar board members stood up. Sterling laid out the second document. "Recovered email, sent by Corinne Lockwood to Preston Lockwood 18 years ago." He read aloud, "Mother's trust clause only applies to biological heirs. If she finds out I cannot have children, I lose everything." He turned the page. "This is business, Preston, not sentiment." Corinne lunged for the documents. Preston grabbed her arm. They turned on each other with synchronized panic. "You said the email server was destroyed," Corinne hissed. "It was supposed to be," Preston started. "Shut up," Corinne snapped. "Do not say another word." But it was too late. The boardroom door opened a second time. Federal agents walked in. They did not sit down. They did not need to. Agent Holloway from the FBI White-Collar Crime Division, a sharp 45-year-old with 2 decades fighting financial predators, stepped through the doorway, flanked by 2 federal officers. "Corinne Lockwood, Preston Lockwood," Agent Holloway said, his voice flat and official. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand embezzlement of $4.8 million from the Ashford Freight Group Employee Pension Fund, and criminal identity fraud under Title 18, United States Code Section 1028. Preston went pale. Corinne straightened her spine, her face transforming into cold fury. "This is absurd," she said. "We have done nothing." "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Holloway continued. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." 2 agents moved behind Corinne and Preston. Steel handcuffs clicked into place. The unfamiliar board members scrambled for the exits. Brielle sat frozen, staring at her parents with dawning horror. Corinne turned her head as the agents led her toward the door. She gave me one final look of pure, freezing hatred. I met her eyes and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I watched her being led out of the boardroom in silence. Preston followed, head down, shoulders hunched. Then I walked to the head of the table and sat down in my rightful executive chair. The city spread out below the windows, Chicago in October gray and gold and steel. Lawrence and I had looked at this view together 1,000 times, planning routes and contracts and the careful architecture of legacy. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany surface. The boardroom was empty now, except for Sterling still standing quietly by the door. "It is finished," he said. "Not quite," I said. "I have one more conversation to have before this day is finished." The federal case moved with unusual speed. Prosecutors called it the strongest paper trail they had seen in years, built on evidence too clean to contest. 3 weeks after that Friday morning, I sat in the back row of a federal courtroom and watched Judge Carmichael deliver the sentences that would permanently erase my daughter and son-in-law from the world they tried to steal. The conversation I had needed to have that Friday was not with Corinne, it was with Brielle, but that would come later. First, I needed to see justice delivered. The Dirksen Federal Building courtroom was packed. Agent Holloway sat in the front row with his case file closed. Sterling sat beside me, hands folded, watching with patient calm. Judge Carmichael, a stern federal jurist with zero tolerance for white-collar criminals, presided over the sentencing with cold precision. Preston and Corinne stood before the bench in standard prison uniforms. No designer suits, no expensive jewelry. The luxurious lives they had built on stolen money had evaporated completely. "Preston Lockwood," Judge Carmichael said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "You systematically plundered the retirement savings of hardworking employees while your mother-in-law grieved her dying husband. You stole from people who trusted you, people who had dedicated decades to building the company you tried to destroy." He paused. "This court shows zero tolerance for such predatory cruelty. You are hereby sentenced to 17 years in federal prison for wire fraud and grand embezzlement." Preston's face went gray. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. Judge Carmichael turned to Corinne. "Corinne Lockwood, you orchestrated a conspiracy that spanned 18 years. You stole an infant from her biological mother. You fabricated identity documents. You manipulated inheritance structures. You exploited your own mother's grief to steal her company." Corinne stood completely frozen as the judge continued. "You are sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit fraud and federal identity crimes." The bailiff approached. Steel handcuffs clicked into place for the second time. I watched them march my daughter out in chains. I felt no joy. I felt no grief. I felt only the quiet satisfaction of a predator who had protected her territory. The courtroom emptied. Sterling and I walked out into the cold November morning in silence. "It is over for them," he said. "Not for me," I replied. "There is still work to do." Hours after the Friday arrests, I had sat with Brielle in a quiet conference room at Ashford headquarters. She was 18 years old, recovering from a motorcycle accident, and her entire world had just collapsed. I explained everything: the DNA tests, the email, the fabricated birth certificate. The woman named Mira Valdez, who had spent 18 years searching for the daughter stolen from her arms. I did not soften the ugly details. She deserved the truth. Brielle listened in silence, tears streaming down her face, hands trembling in her lap. When I finished, she asked one question in a whisper so quiet I almost could not hear it. Did she want to find me?" The question broke something in my chest that I had carefully held together for weeks. "She never stopped looking for you," I said. "Not for 18 years. She went into debt. She lost her apartment. She exhausted every resource she had trying to find you. When your father's lawyers threatened her with harassment charges, she kept searching anyway." Brielle covered her face with her hands and sobbed. I let her cry. Some grief cannot be rushed. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now you make a choice," I said. "I have contacted Mira Valdez. She knows you are alive. She knows where you are. If you want to meet her, I will arrange it. If you need time, I will give you time. This is your decision." "I want to meet her," Brielle said immediately. "I want to know who she is. Then I will make it happen." "And after that," Brielle asked, "where do I go? Corinne and Preston they are in federal custody," I finished, "and they will remain there for a very long time." I reached across the table and took her hand. "I will provide 12 full months of comprehensive university tuition and living expenses anywhere you choose. After that, your path is your own to build." "Why?" Brielle asked. "You do not owe me anything. I am not your granddaughter." "No," I said. "You are not. But you are an 18-year-old girl who was stolen from her mother and used as a tool in someone else's conspiracy. You deserve a chance to build a life that is yours." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. 2 weeks after the arrests, I stood before 317 employees in the main Ashford loading bay. I stood before the people who had trusted me for decades, and I told them the truth. The money was safe, the thieves were imprisoned, and we would rebuild together. Every stolen penny has been recovered and restored to your pension accounts, I said, my voice carrying across the steel rafters. Down to the last dollar. Your retirement is secure. The loading bay erupted in thunderous applause. Workers who had driven trucks through midnight storms for 40 years stood and cheered. Warehouse managers who had built the logistics networks that made Ashford Freight a cornerstone of Chicago commerce shouted my name. Someone yelled, "3 cheers for Mrs. Ashford." The steel rafters shook with their voices. I stood at the microphone and felt something I had not felt in months: pride. Not in defeating my daughter, not in winning some corporate war. Pride in the people who had built this company alongside Lawrence and me, the people who showed up through blizzards and recessions, and the quiet grind of making sure freight moved from point A to point B every single day for decades. This was the company Lawrence and I built from a single truck. These were the people who built it with us. Dalton Hayes stood in the front row with tears in his eyes. I had formally rehired him and every executive wrongfully terminated during Corinne's corporate coup. The company was whole again. After the loading bay emptied, I sat alone in my office and looked out over the city skyline where Lawrence and I had built our dreams. The conspiracy was destroyed, the money was restored, justice was served. But as the November sunset turned the Chicago skyline gold and gray, I knew the truth. Now the real work begins. 6 months after the sentencing, I stood on the rooftop terrace of Ashford Freight while Chicago woke beneath me. The real work had never been destroying the conspiracy. It had been building something that would outlast me, something that honored what Lawrence and I had truly valued, something worthy of the man who had given 43 years of his life to this company and this city. It was April 2022. Spring morning light flooded across the glass towers, turning the entire skyline a burnished gold. 14 floors below on the loading docks, the fleet trucks rumbled out for their morning deliveries, exhaling diesel smoke into the cool air, the same rhythm I had heard every morning for nearly half a century. There was something deeply comforting about that sound. It reminded me that the world kept moving, kept breathing, even when I had stood still. Sterling stood beside the terrace railing with a leather folder tucked under his arm, watching the city stretch endlessly toward the horizon. "Beautiful morning," he said. "It is," I agreed. The wind carried the scent of fresh concrete and distant Lake Michigan. 6 months ago, I had sat in a federal courtroom and watched my daughter led away in handcuffs. I had not allowed myself to collapse then, because collapsing would have meant letting everything Lawrence built collapse with her. Today felt profoundly different. Lighter, like something impossibly heavy, something I had carried so long I had forgotten what it felt like to stand without. It had finally been set down on solid ground. Sterling opened the folder and removed 2 documents, setting them on the small rooftop table with quiet precision. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I have been ready for months," I said. He laid the first document before me, the Employee Stock Ownership Plan Transfer Agreement. The pages were thick, formal, and covered in the careful language of lawyers who understood exactly how much was at stake. 40% equity in Ashford Freight Group, Sterling said. $7.2 million in assessed value transferred to 217 current employees as part owners of this company. I picked up the pen and signed my name without hesitation. The scratch of ink on paper sounded impossibly loud in the quiet of that morning. Louder than the truck engines below, louder than the wind, louder than the years of silence I had kept while the conspiracy hollowed out everything we had built. Just like that, everything changed. The warehouse workers who had driven through midnight blizzards on black ice roads, the logistics coordinators who had built routing systems spanning 3 states, the mechanics who had kept an aging fleet running through economic recessions and brutal winters, they were no longer simply employees collecting a paycheck. They were owners. "How did they react when you told them?" I asked. Sterling smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Tears, complete disbelief, gratitude that none of them quite knew how to express. One of the long-haul drivers thought I was joking and actually hung up on me. And Jacob, the warehouse manager, "He sent you a handwritten note." Sterling drew a plain envelope from the folder and held it out. He asked me to deliver it in person. I opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was uneven and slightly shaky. Jacob was 68 now, his hands weathered by 3 decades working beside Lawrence on that warehouse floor. The note was short. It did not need to be long. "Mrs. Ashford, Lawrence was the best man I ever worked for. Not because he paid well, because he showed up. Every single morning for 30 years he walked that warehouse floor and knew every worker by name, their spouses, their children, their troubles. This ESOP is what he would have wanted. Thank you for remembering what he stood for. Jacob. My throat tightened. I read the note twice, and then folded it carefully, pressing it flat between my palms, as though I could hold the words there permanently. In the distance, an L train bell rang, faint and familiar, carried on the spring wind, like something out of memory. I closed my eyes and saw Lawrence standing on the platform at 6 a.m, briefcase in hand, taking the same route with the same quiet, unshakable dedication he brought to everything. He was never the man of grand gestures or public speeches. He was the man who showed up in good weather and terrible in profitable years and devastating ones. Sterling touched my arm gently, bringing me back to the rooftop, the sunlight, the present. There is one more document, he said. He laid the second agreement on the table, the Lawrence Ashford Memorial Scholarship Fund endowment. The pages looked almost identical to the first, but what they represented felt entirely different, more personal, more permanent in a way that money alone could not measure. $2 million, Sterling said. Designated for first-generation college students pursuing degrees in logistics, supply chain management, and transportation. Preference given to applicants from working-class backgrounds, students with ambition and intelligence, who simply lack the financial means to go as far as their abilities would take them. I signed this one more slowly, thinking about those students, young people who had grown up watching their parents work jobs like the ones on those loading docks below. Young people who deserved every door that money and connection had always kept just slightly out of their reach. How many students in the first cohort? I asked. 12. They begin this fall full tuition textbooks and a living stipend for 4 years. I set the pen down. A sudden gust of wind swept across the rooftop without warning, catching the signed documents and lifting them into the air. Papers scattered like startled birds against the blue morning sky. Sterling and I both lunged at the same instant, me grabbing the ESOP agreement just before it sailed over the railing's edge, him chasing the scholarship endowment as it tumbled wildly across the concrete. We collided, grabbed, laughed, and spent the next 30 seconds scrambling to recover legal documents worth millions of dollars while the spring wind treated them like playthings. When we finally had everything gathered and secured beneath our hands, both of us were breathless and grinning like people who had forgotten briefly and wonderfully to be dignified. That was undignified, Sterling said. It was perfect, I replied. He looked at me with genuine surprise, then nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose it was. We stood together in the sunlight without speaking for a long moment, and for the first time in months, perhaps the first time in years, I felt something that I could only describe as joy. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more durable than happiness. Below, truck horns called out across morning traffic. The Ashford name was painted on every side panel in green and silver, Lawrence's colors rolling through the city he had loved and served every working day of his adult life. There is one more piece of news, Sterling said quietly. I heard from the immigration contact last week. Brielle reunited with Mira Valdez 2 months ago. They are living abroad Spain, I believe. Quietly. Healing. Something settled in my chest. A knot I had not fully realized I was still carrying finally released. Brielle was not my granddaughter. She never had been. But she was a young woman who deserved to know her real mother, to build a life completely free from the conspiracy that had stolen her childhood and her identity, and 18 years of the only relationship that had ever truly belonged to her. I hoped she found everything she was owed. I am glad, I said simply. We stood in comfortable silence as the city fully woke beneath us. The freight trucks carrying the Ashford name through streets. Lawrence had loved the workers who now owned part of what they had built. The students who would one day carry his legacy forward without ever having known his name. I thought about every person who had shown up when it mattered. Sterling, who had spent weeks building an airtight case from fragments. Callan, who had tracked down evidence everyone believed was permanently destroyed. Dalton, who had stayed loyal even when silence would have cost him nothing. Mira Valdez, who had searched for 18 years for a daughter the world had told her to forget. Family, I had come to understand, is not blood. It is not paperwork or history or shared last names. Family is who shows up through blizzards, bankruptcies, grief, and the long, ordinary grind of building something that actually matters. It had taken me 70 years to learn that. Standing on that rooftop in the April light, I was profoundly grateful I had finally learned it at all. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 18 years believing blood meant loyalty. I watched my daughter sit across from me at family dinners, hold my granddaughter who wasn't mine at all, and smile while she plotted to steal everything Lawrence and I had built. Don't make my mistake. Don't assume that the people who share your name will protect what you've worked for. Family drama can hide behind the most familiar faces. I learned something through this family drama. True family is defined by who shows up when everything falls apart, not who shares your DNA. The workers who trusted me, my attorney who fought beside me, they were more family than my daughter ever was. These revenge stories with Mom aren't just about getting even. They're about protecting what you've built and recognizing loyalty where it lives. I believe God put me through this to teach me that legacy isn't bloodline. It's the values you defend and the people who stand with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think I did the right thing? Have you experienced family drama like this? If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more revenge stories with Mom and real-life lessons, subscribe to Silent Revenge with Auntie May. Your support means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. I know these stories aren't easy to hear, but they're important. As a reminder, some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. But the message about trust, loyalty, and protecting what you've built is very real.